In the summer of 1945, as the Second World War drew to a close, the Japanese Empire was collapsing. For 35 years, Korea had lived under Japanese colonial rule, its language suppressed, its resources extracted, its people mobilized for an empire not their own. When Japan finally surrendered in August of that year, Koreans poured into the streets in celebration. After decades of occupation, freedom seemed not only possible, but imminent. What few understood in that moment of euphoria was that liberation would not mean unity. It would mean division. In Washington and Moscow, the future of Korea was not being debated by Koreans. It was being calculated by superpowers. With stunning speed and minimal knowledge of the peninsula's complexities, American officials proposed a temporary administrative line at the 38th parallel, a line drawn hastily across a national geographic map. Soviet forces would accept the Japanese surrender north of that line. American forces would do the same in the south. The intention, at least officially, was administrative convenience. The reality was the opening move of the Cold War. Soviet troops entered the north in August 1945. Weeks later, American forces landed in the south. What had been described as temporary quickly hardened into political reality. In the north, the Soviets backed a young guerrilla fighter who had resisted Japanese rule, Kim Il-sung. Charismatic, disciplined, and aligned with communist ideology, he became the face of a new socialist state. In the south, the United States supported Syngman Rhee, an ardent anti-communist nationalist who had spent years lobbying abroad for Korean independence. Two leaders, two ideologies, one peninsula. By 1948, what had been occupation zones became rival governments. In the north, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was proclaimed under Kim Il-sung. In the south, the Republic of Korea was declared under Syngman Rhee. Both claimed to be the sole legitimate government of all Korea. The 38th parallel was no longer just a line, it was a fault line. Tensions escalated quickly. Border skirmishes became frequent. Propaganda flowed across the divide. Each side believed reunification was inevitable, but under its own system. Then, at dawn on June 25, 1950, North Korean forces surged across the 38th parallel in a full-scale invasion. The Korean War had begun. Within days, Seoul fell. North Korean troops pushed south with astonishing speed, nearly driving South Korean and American forces into the sea. The United States, acting under the banner of the United Nations, intervened militarily. Soon, soldiers from multiple nations were fighting on Korean soil. The war was no longer a civil conflict. It was an international battleground of the Cold War. In September 1950, a daring amphibious landing at Incheon, orchestrated by General Douglas MacArthur, turned the tide. UN forces recaptured Seoul and advanced northward, crossing the 38th parallel themselves. The objective shifted from defense to reunification, this time under the South Authority. But as UN troops approached the Yalu River near the Chinese border, a new player entered the war. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers poured into Korea, pushing UN forces back in a brutal winter counteroffensive. The war settled into a grinding stalemate near the original dividing line. Trenches scarred the hills. Artillery thundered across valleys. Villages were destroyed and rebuilt, only to be destroyed again. Civilians suffered immensely. Families separated. Cities reduced to rubble. Millions displaced. By the time an armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, no peace treaty had been concluded. The fighting stopped. The war technically did not. The armistice established the Korean Demilitarized Zone, the DMZ, a heavily fortified strip of land roughly following the 38th parallel. Ironically, it became one of the most militarized borders in the world. Barbed wire, landmines, guard towers, and soldiers standing face-to-face across a narrow strip of land. A physical manifestation of ideological division. In the decade that followed, the two Koreas moved in dramatically different directions. In the north, Kim Il-sung consolidated power into a rigid, centralized regime built on the ideology of Juche, self-reliance. The state controlled information, industry, and daily life. A personality cult elevated Kim to near-mythical status. After his death in 1994, power passed to his son, Kim Jong-il, and later to his grandson, Kim Jong-un. The regime endured through isolation, repression, and an expanding nuclear program designed to guarantee survival. In the South, political instability and authoritarian rule marked the early decades. Yet over time, South Korea underwent rapid industrialization, transforming into one of the world's leading economies. Democratic reforms in the late 20th century reshaped its political landscape. Today, Seoul stands as a global center of technology, culture, and finance, a stark contrast to Pyongyang's isolation. Despite these diverging paths, the two Koreas remain locked in a state of unresolved conflict. Why? The answer lies not only in ideology, but in geopolitics. The Korean Peninsula sits at the crossroads of powerful neighbors, China, Japan, and Russia. For the United States, South Korea remains a critical ally in East Asia. Tens of thousands of American troops are still stationed there. For China, North Korea serves as a strategic buffer state, preventing U.S. forces from standing directly on its border. The division of Korea is not merely a domestic issue. It is embedded in the balance of global power. There have been moments of hope. In 2000, a historic summit between North and South Korean leaders hinted at reconciliation. In 2018, dramatic images showed South Korean President Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un stepping across the borderline together inside the DMZ. Families separated for decades were briefly reunited in emotional meetings. Yet each thaw has been followed by renewed tension, missile tests, military drills, diplomatic breakdowns. The nuclear issue remains central. North Korea views its nuclear arsenal as insurance against foreign intervention. From its perspective, the fate of leaders like Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi is a warning. Nuclear weapons are not aggression. They are survival. For the United States and its allies, however, a nuclear-armed North Korea poses a regional and global threat. Negotiations stall on this fundamental mistrust. Meanwhile, generations have grown up knowing only division. South Koreans born after the war often see reunification as abstract, even burdensome. The economic gap between the two states is vast. Integrating them would be enormously costly. In the North, information about the South is tightly controlled. The psychological distance has grown as wide as the physical one. And yet, technically, the war has never ended. No peace treaty has replaced the 1953 armistice. The peninsula remains suspended in a fragile equilibrium, not at war, not at peace. So why is Korea still divided today? Because the line drawn in 1945 was never just a temporary measure. It became entrenched in ideology, solidified by war, reinforced by superpower rivalry, and maintained by mutual fear. It survives because the strategic interests of powerful nations intersect there. It endures because trust has never fully taken root. The Korean Peninsula is a living remnant of the Cold War, a place where history never fully moved on. Families remain separated. Soldiers still stand guard. Loudspeakers sometimes broadcast propaganda across the silence. Beneath the watchtowers and minefields lies a deeper truth. Division, once institutionalized, is extraordinarily difficult to undo. More than 70 years after the guns fell silent, Korea remains divided not because reunification is impossible, but because the cost, the risk, and the geopolitical consequences continue to outweigh the will to change it. The line at the 38th parallel endures, not as a relic, but as a reminder of how global conflict can fracture a nation and how some fractures never fully heal.